Hi, and welcome to this session on critical perspectives on gender and sexual identities. Hopefully you will have engaged in the activity and will have made some reflections. So it will be interesting to go back after this session and see if your reflections have changed as a result of what we cover here. So what are we going to cover? Well, we're going to look at defining sex and defining gender. We'll be exploring gender as a social construct and looking at masculinity and femininity, and then looking at gender as a critical social issue. So sex and gender are distinct from one another. So sex is biological differences between men and women, and gender refers to ascribed and prescribed behaviours that are associated with these categories of women and men. And note that these are culturally constructed differences. So we're not born with these differences ingrained in us. They are something that society ascribes to us, and that will vary from one culture to another. What tends to happen is that gender and sex are conflated in practice as well as when they're being spoken about, and there's this assumption that gender and sex map neatly onto one another, but as we'll see, that's not always the case. So sex is chromosomal. It's about the gonads we have, whether we have eggs or sperm, facial hair, secondary sexual features like breasts, and it's maleness, femaleness. Whereas gender refers to the socially constructed roles, the behaviours and activity that society thinks is appropriate for girls and boys, for men and women, and it's the cultural or social interpretation of sex, so they are distinct. So sex is something that's biological, and gender is something that is both personal and subjective, and also something that is societal. So there are societal norms around gender. So gender could be about masculinity and femininity, whether you identify as a man or identify as a woman, whereas sex is those biological and physiological characteristics that one can be identified as male or female by. So gender is more about masculinity and femininity. So masculine and feminine are gender categories, whereas male and female are sex categories. And gender identity is about how you see yourself. So where on the spectrum of masculinity and femininity do you see yourself? And that's often based on society's definitions of appropriate gender roles. So if you're a man, then you're more likely to identify or feel that it's appropriate to identify as being masculine. Whereas if you're a woman, you might feel that it's more appropriate to identify as being feminine, and that is what the media tends to represent. And so society, media being part of that, kind of tells us about what sort of characteristics and attitudes, what kind of feelings and behaviours that are expected of us when we're female and when we're male. And as we know, those differ. So here's the genderbread person. So this is quite a good way, a visual representation that sets out the difference between gender identity, gender expression, biological sex and sexual orientation, because often these things can get quite confusing. So it just shows that identity is something that's sort of in the mind. It's the way we conceive of ourselves. It's how we interpret our identity in terms of gender. So gender expression is whether we express that gender identity in femininity, masculinity, or being androgynous. So kind of being androgyny is where you could be ambiguous about your gender roles. So you're neither male nor female particularly, or you have aspects of both. There is also non-binary as well, but we'll discuss that later on. Then we've got biological sex. So at one end of the spectrum we have female, at the other we have male, and then we have intersex as well. So intersex is where you have both combination of both male and female chromosomes and or genitalia. And then we have, of course, sexual orientation. So we've got heterosexual, completely straight at one end, homosexual, completely gay at the other, bisexual in the middle, and actually there are other sexualities as well, which we'll discuss. So this doesn't cover everything. We haven't covered things like non-binary, people who are gender fluid, transgender, non-binary, trans-masculine. There are lots of different things as well, and there's also pansexual individuals. So we're going to discuss all of that a bit later, but this diagram might be useful to just refer back to. So coming back to this idea of sex, so you think, well, you're either male or female, so that's fairly straightforward, but this simple dichotomy can cause problems. One of the problems is that we tend to use the term gender differences when we're using a biological framework. So as we've already seen, sex is biological, gender is social, psychological. So, I mean, you can tell people till you're blue in the face, gender is a psychological and social construct, whereas sex is a biological one. But this just keeps happening in the literature. Gender is a psychological phenomenon as a result of complex interactions between the natural, so sex, and the social, so how we perceive ourselves in the light of the culture and the society that we live in. So these distinctions can be misleading, so you need to make sure when you're referring to gender, refer to gender. When you're referring to someone's biological sex, use the term sex. So gender differences, like you might say, oh, there are gender differences between males and females on maths performance. There may well be gender differences, but most likely what you're referring to is sex differences. So just trying to be specific. Now, having said that, it is generally accepted that the boundaries are blurred, but extreme deviation from the norms of whichever sex you are is often sufficient to question your sex. So you might have heard of the controversy surrounding Caster Semenya. So she has high levels of testosterone, which enhance her performance as an athlete, and that's caused questions to be raised about her gender, and the International Athletics Foundation got involved with doing investigations, and she's been told that she might actually have to have hormone replacement therapy to reduce her levels of testosterone because it gives her, unquote, an unfair advantage over other females. So, there's kind of issues even around the biology there. So if you deviate from your biology, it can cause questions about, well, what sex are you? Is she a woman? Just because she's got testosterone, does that make her partly male? So this is just an example of how gender attributes are presumed to map directly onto biological sex. It's not as cut and dried as we like to think it is. So are they mutually exclusive? Well, let's rest on the assumption that there are two distinct sex categories, which is problematic. There isn't just male and female. We don't all have unequivocal male or female bodies or hormonal and chromosomal compositions, as we've seen in terms of hormones from Semenya there. And then we can also have people who have atypical chromosomal patterns. So you might have come across Klinefelter's and Turner syndrome. So those are where you have extra copies, or you're missing part of the copies of the X or Y chromosomes. And then you can have genitalia that's ambiguous, i.e. you're intersex. So there have been other terms used for people, like hermaphrodite is an old term that was used to describe someone who is now referred to as intersex. But if you're born with ambiguous genitalia, rather than waiting until you've grown up and decided what your gender identity is, you tend to get your sex surgically reassigned to you, and often that's not to do with what chromosomes you have, which may well be linked to your gender identity, and it's not due to what they might believe the sex or the gender identity you may have when you grow up. It's quite often based on what's the easiest surgery to perform on the baby. So they're not mutually exclusive, and it's problematic to assume that gender will map directly onto sex. So this kind of brings us to disrupting the binary, so that you may have heard the term non-binary. If you watch Billions, you might be familiar with Taylor. My pronouns are they, theirs, them. So people who are non-binary they don't want to be referred to as he or she, or have words like his or hers used. They don't see themselves as fitting either into that male or female category, and they're not necessarily transgender either. So it's just simply that they don't feel that that binary represents their gender identity. Then there are also individuals who define as transgender. And again, it's this problematic assumption that gender maps directly onto biological sex. You hear a lot of people saying, well, I don't understand how you can be a man and feel like you're a woman, and that's because gender and sex are not the same thing. And being transgender is where you're born as either a male or female, but you feel like you are another gender. And that can be really distressing for individuals. There's, obviously we've got society doesn't deem that as normal and appropriate. There's also confusion for those individuals and the processes that they go through, which is beyond the scope of what we're going to discuss here, but it's just good to know that that's not a straightforward process for them. So there's a wide range of differences within male, female, gender, sex categories that we've seen a little bit of already. And then we've got people who are genderqueer, so as I've mentioned, non-binary or gender fluid. So non-binary, I've said, it's where you don't feel that you fit anywhere within that gender binary. Gender fluidity is more about, being fluid between masculinity and femininity. So sometimes feeling more masculine, sometimes more fluid. Agender, just really not relating to gender at all. And then third gender, which we'll have a look at an example of shortly. So, feminist understandings of gender. So, feminist understandings are that there is no essential, universally distinct character that is masculine or feminine. So, there isn't anything that should be feminine and should be seen as masculine. So, these representations of masculinities and femininities are culturally dependent and contextual. There are many of them, and they change, so they're dynamic and they're interrelated and influence how we define ourselves. So it's not cut and dried. It's not that something that's masculine will always be masculine, that something that's feminine will always be feminine, because masculinities and femininities change depending on culture, they change depending on time, both within the individual and within society. So girls and boys are actively involved in constructing their own gendered identities, and that's subject to change. So again, it's changing, ongoing, changeable, rather than this static thing. So masculine, though, is often treated as the default human experience by social norms, by the law, and other social institutions. One example is the gender pay gap. And masculinity tends to be, has traditionally, it's getting less so, but it's traditionally privileged over all things feminine. So masculine activities tend to be favoured over feminine ones, so they're the more important ones. The same behaviours in men and women will be evaluated differently. For example, men will be seen as being more assertive, women seen as pushy, and male lecturers rated better than female lecturers. And I'm going to link you to a couple of articles on that to have a look at. So then, masculinity. Well, what is masculinity? I mean, there's a lot of there's been a lot in the media about this crisis that men have in terms of not knowing what it is to be a man. What is expected of men. We want men to be strong, or women want men to be strong, stoic, dependable, but we also want them to be sensitive and compassionate. So what is masculinity? Well, it's difficult to define exactly what it is. It's defined as a broad set of processes, and it's based on gender relations and practices between men and women, and you can read the Connell paper if you're particularly interested in that. But again, coming back to this, culture dictates ways of being masculine and unmasculine. So it's our culture that tells us what is masculine and what isn't. And gender power is held by white, highly educated, middle-class, able-bodied, heterosexual men whose gender represents hegemonic masculinity, which is the ideal, and that exists as a cultural script. So hegemonic masculinity is kind of the dominant male. So Donald Draper, if you ever watch Mad Men, he's this advertising executive, the middle-class, able-bodied, heterosexual, white, highly educated man who exerts power over women and also over other men. So there's this masculine ideal whereby you're powerful and you're strong and you are at the top of the hierarchy. It's not easy to define what hegemonic masculinity is, but again, you can look in Connell's paper there if you're particularly interested in that. But there is this cultural script that is the kind of man that all men should aspire to be in terms of masculinity. And young men will police masculinity. So they'll make jokes like, you're a fag. You get called a fag when you engage in behaviour that's outside the gender norm. For example, if you're being too expressive with your emotions. Other times as well, like you can, quite commonly hear guys describing other guys as being a pussy, for example. So terms like that get used. And obviously that's that those terms, one is a man who's attracted to other men, and the other term is commonly used to refer to female genitalia. So both of those are expressing unmasculinity. So Pascoe found that actually being gay was more acceptable than being a man who didn't fit with the hegemonic ideal. So it was more acceptable to just be in almost a completely different category, as it were, than to be a man who identifies as being masculine and male and a man, but who does not fit with the cultured stereotypes and the gender roles that are prescribed by society. So then femininity. So again, femininity, just like masculinity, is constructed through patriarchal ideas. And so women are always inferior to men. And women lack the same level of cultural power as men, and that has an adverse effect on them because of this traditional masculine dominated society. And gender-based harassment serves as a form of policing gender boundaries. So girls are expected to conform to stereotypical gendered appearances, and this is often very subtle. And when you speak to people about the ways in which gender based harassment occurs, they'll often put it in terms that absolve them from responsibility. So it's very subtle, it's very pervasive, and most people don't even have awareness of the fact that they're doing it because it's so ingrained in our society. So we construct our subjectivities within a framework of gender differences. So gender's our reference point for measuring how we fit, how we deviate, and how our conformity is policed. So gendered subjectivity signals how we're moving away from this innate idea of sexual identity dividing us into male and female, and about how we generate our own gender internally. So it's talking about, well, how do differences and similarities between genders arise? How do we construct our gender? So this is quite an important critical issue in gender studies. And it's easier for girls and women to move between gender differentiated positions. So, for example, if you're a woman who dresses as a tomboy, that's more acceptable than a man who wears dresses, for example. So it's easier for women to kind of dress and behave in ways that deviate from feminine norms because they're less stigmatized than men are if they do the same. But there's multiple forms of masculinities and multiple forms of femininities. For example, there's new masculinities emerging. So, as I've referred to already, we've got this idea of the sensitive new age guy, the metrosexual. But some forms are more socially valued than others. So these archetypal forms of masculinity, such as the hegemonic masculinity, are still highly valued, being strong, dependable, and stoic. So imagine the following. You're a man walking down the street, wearing some lipstick, heels and a skirt, and people look at you. Some of them are casting sidelong glances, others are openly staring, trying to make sense of this social aberration they see before them. So they may well decide that you're a transgender person who perhaps deliberately didn't get it quite right, a gay man heading for a drag club, or a straight man in fancy dress heading out to a stag night. So gender limits how we view the world and the people in it, and what we can do with our lives. It's not considered normal for men to routinely wear what's perceived as women's clothing or makeup. There has to be some sort of explanation. So one of those categories, you have to be able to put someone in a category. It can't just be that that person is expressing themselves for some other reason. And engaging in gender-bending behaviour, you reside in a special category according to people who are interpreting your behaviour, such as you must be gay, you must be transgender, or it's an exceptional context, such as a stag do. So gender's the backcloth of society against which our daily lives are played out. It suffuses our existence so that, like breathing, it becomes invisible to us because of its familiarity. So it really is so deeply ingrained and embedded. And it's a critical social issue. There are profound consequences of gender on everyone's lives, so those who always notice it are those who don't fit within its remit. So if gender is the backcloth against which our lives exist, then you won't notice it unless that doesn't fit with you. If it chafes you, then you won't notice it. Men and women's lives continue to be shaped by the different expectations and opportunities that are placed upon and given to them. And although there have been significant social changes, there are still huge inequalities in several areas. And gender-appropriate behaviour structures people's lives. It structures the roles you can take on, the way you relate to people, how you identify, and even mundane practices such as whether you bare your chest or not. You're shirtless if you're a man who is not wearing a top, but you're topless if you're a woman, and that means because you're exposing your breasts. It dictates whether you wear perfume or aftershave, and how much your time and your work are valued. So gender is a strong indicator of how your behaviour is judged. So how, again, your time and work are valued, division of labour in different areas, how you're evaluated. So if, for example, the same behaviour is being evaluated differently in men and women. And that means that it's associated with inequalities, exclusions, and also experiences of abuse. So you can be subject to disadvantage, disparity, and discrimination based on your gender. So it's a really, really important issue. And it's crucial in determining the likelihood of violence, whether you're going to enact that violence or experience it. Other issues are denial of child custody to lesbian mothers. So obviously there are these problematic assumptions of gender and seeing lesbian mothers as not being fit parents. Critical psychologists are trying to engage in tasks that critique these normative frameworks of gender and of the heteronormative society that we live in. They're saying that the heteronormative, so the norm that heterosexuality is considered to be, doesn't have to be a norm. So not seeing people who are gay and lesbian as being deviant in some way. So critical social psychology is about trying to identify these things and see them and work on them to change them and to challenge these issues. So as psychologists, psychology has a regulatory role. So mainstream psychology has played a role in normative conceptions of sex, of gender and sexuality. And often psychology research doesn't question or critique the implicit assumptions. For example, stages of psychosexual development that Freud outlined, the assumption that heterosexuality is the norm, that heterosexual people are all appropriately gendered. So rather than investigating the concerns that arise, assumptions are often treated as legitimate, and that means that they're perpetuated in society. But as psychologists, we have the power to do something about that, and that's what critical psychology is about. So in this session, we've looked at the differences between gender and sex and how they're distinct from one another. We've looked at gender as a social construct, gender identity being personal and subjective, and gender roles resulting from societal expectations and culture. We've seen that gender is a critical issue that affects how people behave, how they're evaluated, and how they're valued. And psychology has a role in critiquing and challenging these norms, especially where they lead to inequality.